Hello, and welcome to the last lesson of the course Getting Started. Today we'll be covering basic strategy, namely the importance of material and opening principles. So let's revisit material. As you know, the pawns, rooks, knights, bishops, and queens all have a material value. Now these pawns are worth 1 point each. The knights and bishops, also known as the minor pieces, are worth 3 points each. The rook is worth 5 points, and the queen is worth 9 points. So what do these points mean? Well, the more points a piece has, the more valuable it is. So, for example, 9 pawns, if you could have 9 pawns, would technically be equal to a queen in terms of points. 3 minor pieces, or like a knight and 2 bishops, would be equivalent in power to a queen. So this point system is an easy way to identify how powerful a piece is. So why is material important then? Well, the difference in material between white and black can tell us who has the advantage in a position. So if you have more material than your opponent, usually you'll have an advantage. So quite obviously, if I take away this queen, I can say that white has a material advantage. The reason why it's good to be up in material is because it makes it easier to checkmate your opponent, because your opponent has less pieces than you. So now that we know that, material forces you to think whether or not you can make certain exchanges or not. So let me set up an arbitrary position where if I had something like this, something very basic, you can ask yourself, is it okay for black to take this pawn from black's perspective? So if he takes this pawn, he gains 1 point in material, but what white can do back is to take the knight, and once he takes the knight, he gains 3 points in material. So now you have to ask yourself, in this final position, who ended up with the better deal? And the answer is white. He had a net gain of 2 points. He lost a pawn and gained a knight. So in this position, it is not advisable for black to capture this pawn on e4 because it leaves him in a worse position, or he loses material in the exchange. So this concept of material and points is very useful when you delve into more complicated tactics. And tactics is a term that involves combinations and exchanges that we'll explore later on in another course. Now, the next thing I want to cover is opening principles. And the first thing, there's 3 of them, and the first one I want to cover is control of the center. Now, the center is the 4 squares e4, d4, d5, and e5. So these 4 squares constitute the center. And what every early chess player learns is it's very important to take control of the center. But why, you might ask? Well, material isn't the only realization of an advantage. So it's obvious that if you take away some pieces on the other side will have an advantage, but you can also have an advantage in other respects, even when there's equal material on the board. So let me demonstrate. White can have a stake in the center by moving his 2 pawns up here. So let's just look at white's position for now. So if he puts his 2 pawns here, he occupies 2 squares in the center, e4 and d4, and he also attacks 2 other squares, d5 and e5. So you might ask, well, why does that matter at all? And the answer is it gives him more space. And space is another example of an advantage that one side can have over another. And the reason why space is considered an advantage is because it gives your opponent less room to move his pieces around, and it gives you more room. Now, the next opening principle is very closely tied to control of the center, and it's development. So development is a very easy to understand term. It's just getting your pieces out. And what I mean by getting your pieces out is just developing them. So if I move my knight to c3, my knight to f3, my bishop to f4, and my bishop to c4, I could say that my minor pieces are developed. Now, why would development be important in the opening? Well, you don't want your pieces to be on the first rank doing nothing, because they're not serving any purpose here. What they want to do is they want to be in the battle, and this usually occurs around the center area, so it's natural to develop them in squares that help you attack the center. Now, the last opening principle is king safety. Now, you learned in a previous lesson that the game ends in checkmate, or when the king is in check and cannot escape. Because of this, if you don't want to lose, of course, you want to make sure your king is safe and well protected. So we learned the concept of castling, also in an earlier lesson, where the king can move 2 squares towards a rook, and the rook jumps over the king. And of course, you can do this on either side. And there's a bunch of rules whether or not you can castle. Like you can't castle after you move your king, and you can't castle on one side after you move your rook, along with other rules. Now, castling is important, especially in the opening, because it deals with king safety. King safety is when the king is sheltered, and it's not easy for your opponent to attack it, because of course you don't want to be checkmated, you want to checkmate your opponent. So, if white castles kingside here, in this position, then I would say that this king is much safer than he was here on e1. It's much safer on g1, defended by his pawns here. And another benefit of castling is not only does it contribute to king safety, by putting the king safely in a corner and not in the middle anymore, but it also helps develop a rook. So this rook on h1, which was not developed, is now fairly developed on f1. So that concludes our video. Thank you for watching. Now go ahead and try completing the following exercises.